The first thing I heard after they cut me open was my sister-in-law's voice in the hallway, low and pleased with itself, saying, "The closing already went through. Don't worry, she'll never know until it's too late." I was not supposed to be conscious. The anesthesiologist had told my ex-husband, back when I still had one of those, back when there was still someone in the waiting room pretending to care, that the sedation would hold for hours after the appendectomy. But there's a strange half place you drift through when your body is fighting an infection and your mind is fighting to surface. And I was caught there, weightless, drowning in white noise, when Priya's laugh cut through it like a blade finding a seam. I tried to open my eyes. They wouldn't obey. I tried to speak. My throat was full of tube and cotton and betrayal. I lay there, gutted in more ways than one, and listened to my brother's wife congratulate herself on selling my dead mother's house while I was too unconscious to stop her. My mother's house, the one she'd left me, the one I had been fighting my brother Denny and his wife for 11 months, ever since the funeral, ever since the will was read and Denny's face had gone the color of old meat. Eleanor Voss, Mom, written it plainly. No ambiguity, no loopholes, a decent lawyer couldn't have protected. To my daughter Mara, the house on Birchwood Lane, together with the adjoining parcels recorded under my name, in recognition of everything she gave up to care for me, and in the hope that she will always have a place that is only hers. They contested it anyway. Of course they did. Denny had never once, in 34 years, let an unclaimed dollar pass him by, and Priya had a genius for turning grief into leverage. They said Mom hadn't been of sound mind. They said I'd manipulated a dying woman. They hired a lawyer named Grant Hollis, an old college buddy of Denny's with a haircut like a used car salesman and the ethics to match, and Hollis had spent months finding every crack in the will he could pry open. And apparently, while I was on a table getting my appendix removed, an emergency surgery, scheduled with exactly the kind of short notice that leaves no room to argue, to object, to lawyer up, but they had found their crack. They had rushed a closing. They had sold my mother's house and the land around it to a developer, while I was unconscious and legally unable to stop a single signature. I felt the monitor beside me do something strange. A flutter, then a drag, then a long, terrible stillness. And the last thing I heard before the black took me all the way down was a nurse's voice going sharp and fast, calling a code, calling my name, and none of it mattering because I was already gone, already falling through the floor of the world, and then I was 12 years old again. No, not 12, 31. Lying in my childhood bed under an In Sync poster I hadn't thought about in a decade, staring up at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like a rabbit that I used to trace with my eyes to fall asleep. Sunlight, bird song, the smell of coffee and burnt toast drifting up the stairs, and underneath it, unmistakable, a voice. "Mara, you're going to be late for work if you don't get up right now." My mother's voice, alive. Not a memory, not a dream, not grief playing tricks. Alive downstairs, irritated in the exact warm, familiar way she used to get irritated at me for oversleeping, for being late, for being exactly the kind of person who needed to be shouted up a flight of stairs on a Tuesday morning. I looked at the calendar tacked above my desk. It took me a long moment to understand what I was looking at because the year printed at the top of it was wrong, was 3 years wrong, was a year in which my mother had not yet had her stroke, in which I did not yet have a scar from an appendectomy, in which Grant Hollis had not yet found his crack in a will that hadn't been written yet because the woman it belonged to hadn't died yet. I sat there with my heart hammering and understood. In the particular clean and terrible way you understand things that shouldn't be true, but undeniably are, that I had been given something back. Not my mother. Not permanently, I would learn to think of it that way, carefully, protectively, the way you handle something you know you're going to lose again. But time. 3 years of it. 3 years in which I knew with total and merciless clarity exactly what was coming. I knew the day my mother would have her stroke. I knew the day Denny and Priya would start circling. I knew Grant Hollis's name before I'd ever have a reason to hate it. I knew that somewhere out there, a developer named Colum Bratcher was about to start quietly buying up land on a street called Birchwood Lane for a highway expansion and retail corridor that nobody in this sleepy little town had been told about yet, because I had heard Bratcher himself gloating. At the closing my family arranged behind my back, The first time around, boasting about how cheap he'd gotten the whole block because nobody but him knew what was coming. I lay there for a long time before I could make myself move, running my hands over the quilt my grandmother had sewn, the one I hadn't seen in years because it had gone missing at some point. After the house sold, packed off in a box to a stranger's estate sale, probably, or thrown away by movers who didn't know what they were touching. I pressed my palm flat against the fabric and felt every stitch of it like proof, like something the universe couldn't take back from me twice. Downstairs, a chair scraped against linoleum. A radio clicked on to the classic rock station my mother always claimed she didn't really listen to, and then hummed along to anyway. I heard her fill the kettle. I heard the particular rattle of the silverware drawer that never quite closed right. A rattle I hadn't consciously remembered until that exact second, and that hit me now like a physical blow because I understood all at once that I had gotten every ordinary, unremarkable sound of my old life handed back to me, and that most people never get to know in advance exactly how much those sounds are worth. I lay in my childhood bed with the sun on my face, and I made myself a promise. This time, I wasn't going to be the person things happened to. This time, I was going to be the thing that happened to them. To understand why I meant that with my whole ruined heart, you have to understand what my family took from me the first time. Before I had any of this, you have to understand what it costs to be the good daughter in a family that only respects leverage. My mother built that house herself in every sense that matters. My father left when I was 6 and Denny was 11, and he didn't leave much behind besides a mortgage and a habit Denny picked up early of treating every relationship like a transaction he needed to win. Mom worked 2 jobs for years, days at a dental office, nights doing the books for a hardware store, and never once made me feel like I was a burden for existing. Even when money was so tight, I wore Denny's hand-me-down coats until I was 14. She was careful with every dollar in a way that looked, from the outside, almost eccentric. She clipped coupons. She drove a car until it groaned in protest. And she bought land. Not much, not fast, not flashy. A neighboring lot here when a foreclosure came cheap. Another when an elderly neighbor died with no heirs willing to deal with the paperwork. By the time I was in my 20s, my mother owned not just our house on Birchwood Lane, but 4 of the surrounding parcels patched together over 2 decades of a woman nobody thought was paying attention, quietly building something. She used to walk me down the street sometimes and say, half joking, half not, "One day this whole road's going to be worth something, and it's going to be because I never once believed a bank about what I could or couldn't afford." Denny thought she was being foolish. Denny wanted her to sell it all, take the equity, buy something newer, closer to him, easier to visit on holidays he mostly skipped anyway. Denny visited twice a year and called on her birthday if Priya remembered to remind him. I was the one who drove over every Sunday. I was the one who sat with her through chemo when she had the breast cancer scare in her 50s. I was the one who learned to give her the eye drops for her glaucoma because her hands shook too much to do it herself. None of that mattered to Denny except as a resentment. He called me the favorite, like I'd stolen something. Like devotion was a con I was running, instead of the only currency I'd ever had. When Mom died, a stroke. Sudden, merciless. 3 years from that morning, I woke up back in my old bed. I was the one who found her. I was the one who planned the funeral while Denny argued about the cost of the flowers. And I was the one named plainly and deliberately as the sole heir to the house and the land because my mother, whatever else she got wrong in her life, had never once been confused about who had actually shown up for her. Denny and Priya's response to grief was litigation. They hired Grant Hollis within 2 weeks of the funeral. They spent 11 months trying to convince a judge that my dying mother hadn't known her own mind when she wrote a will that had, in fact, been drafted and notarized 4 years before her death by a lawyer she'd chosen herself, in full possession of every faculty she'd ever had. It was never really about the law, it was about wearing me down. Priya used to say at the one mediation session I agreed to sit through, "We just think it's fairer if everyone gets something," with a smile that made my skin crawl because I knew that fairness had never once entered into any decision either of them had ever made. And then, in the middle of that grinding, ugly fight, my appendix decided to rupture. Sudden, agonizing, an emergency surgery scheduled with barely 6 hours' notice. I remember calling Denny from the hospital bed before they wheeled me in, half out of my mind with pain, saying, "Please, just don't do anything with the house while I'm under, please." And hearing him say in a voice so smooth I should have known right then, "Of course not, Mara, just focus on getting better." They forged a settlement out of a mediated framework document I'd never actually agreed to, using a signature stamp from an earlier unrelated filing. Grant Hollis found a judge sympathetic to expediting estate resolution given ongoing litigation costs. Colum Bratcher's company had cash ready and a closing scheduled before I was even out of recovery. By the time I woke up from that first surgery, really woke up, in a hospital bed instead of my childhood bedroom 3 years in the past, the house was gone. The land was gone. Denny and Priya split a check for $400,000, a number so far below what that street was actually worth, that even now, saying it out loud, I want to put my fist through a wall. They didn't even come to see me in the hospital. They sent a text. Hope you're feeling better. We know this has been hard for everyone. We think this is what's best for the family. I remember reading that text 3 times, lying in a hospital bed with a fresh surgical scar and an IV line taped to the back of my hand and feeling something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. The particular stillness that comes right before you understand a thing has actually broken, permanently, and there is no fixing it, only living around the wound. I called Denny. He didn't pick up. I called again an hour later, and again the next morning, and by the 3rd day, I understood he wasn't going to answer, that whatever conversation he'd been willing to have with me was going to happen entirely on his terms. At a time of his choosing, if it happened at all. It didn't, not really. What happened instead was a certified letter, 2 weeks later, informing me that the estate matter had been resolved through mediated settlement and enclosing a check for a fraction of what should have been mine even under their own lowball accounting. A number so insulting, I sat with it in my lap for 20 minutes before I could make myself put it down. I didn't cash it. I couldn't. Cashing it would have felt like agreeing to the story they were telling about what had happened. And I wasn't ready, not yet, to agree to anything. I spent the following 8 months of that old life doing the things people do when the ground has been pulled out from under them and there's no clean way to get it back. I hired a lawyer who told me gently that the settlement, however it had been obtained, would be expensive and difficult to unwind, that Grant Hollis had been careful enough anyway, to survive a cursory review, and that I might spend more fighting it than I'd ever recover. I believed him because I was too exhausted and too heartbroken to imagine there might be another way. I moved into a studio apartment across town. I stopped driving past Birchwood Lane because seeing the for sale sign and then the sold sign and then eventually the construction fencing going up around a development I didn't understand yet was more than I could stand. I got divorced around then too, from a marriage that had already been dying quietly for 2 years and simply didn't survive the added weight of watching me disappear into grief. My ex-husband wasn't cruel about it exactly. He just wasn't equipped for a version of me that had stopped believing the people who were supposed to love her would ever choose her over their own convenience. And honestly, I don't blame him for that. I wasn't equipped for it either. That was the world I died knowing. That was the last thing I understood before I woke up in a bed with a rabbit-shaped water stain on the ceiling and my mother's living voice calling up the stairs, and I promise you I have never in my life felt anything as close to grace as I felt lying there, understanding that I had been given the single thing that might have let me stop it. I want to be honest about something ugly because this isn't a fairy tale and I'm not interested in pretending it was simple. My first instinct, lying there that morning with 3 years of foreknowledge glowing in my chest like a coal, was to run downstairs and grab my mother and tell her everything. Tell her about the stroke. Tell her the date. Beg her to see a doctor, to take blood thinners, to change whatever needed changing so that this time she'd live. I actually got as far as the top of the stairs before I stopped. I didn't understand, not then, and honestly not fully even now, how fragile this gift was. I didn't know if changing one thing would unravel everything else I knew. The stroke's timing, Denny's greed, the sale, Bratcher's plans, all of it tangled together in a pattern I only understood because I'd lived it once in order, cause following effect. What if I told her, and she panicked, and something else happened sooner, worse, unpredictable? What if the very act of trying to save her canceled out the only advantage I had? My memory of exactly how everyone around me would behave when they thought no one was watching. I stood at the top of those stairs for a long time. Long enough that my mother called up again, more gently this time. "Mara, you okay, honey?" "Yeah," I called back, my voice cracking. "Yeah, Mom, coming down." I thought, too, about the mechanics of it in the cold, practical way that would come to define most of the next 3 years. If I told her and she believed me, what then? Doctors can't treat a stroke that hasn't happened based on a daughter's unexplained certainty. I could get her checked, monitored, medicated for whatever showed up on paper, But the actual event, the specific catastrophic failure of a blood vessel in a specific part of her brain on a specific afternoon, wasn't something any test I could arrange would reliably catch in advance. And if I panicked her, if I made her spend 3 years afraid of her own body, waiting for a blow that might or might not still land, I didn't know if that was a kindness or a second cruelty, layered on top of the first. I made a decision that morning that I have turned over in my hands every day since, checking it for rot, and I still don't know if it was the right one, only that it was mine. I decided I would try, quietly, carefully, without tipping my hand, to change the things I could change without unraveling the fragile machinery of what I knew. I would look harder at the medical warning signs as they approached, get her to a doctor for routine checkups I'd insist on, without ever saying the word stroke out loud where it might spook the universe into moving up its schedule. And in the meantime, whatever happened to her, whatever I could or couldn't stop, I would make absolutely certain that no one, not Denny, not Priya, not Grant Hollis, not a stranger named Colum Bratcher, would ever again be able to steal what she'd built out from under either of us. I went downstairs and I hugged my mother so hard she laughed and asked what had gotten into me, and I said, "Nothing, I just love you." And she rolled her eyes and told me my eggs were getting cold, and I sat down at that kitchen table and I started, quietly in my head, to build a war. The first thing I did once I'd stopped shaking was remember everything I could about the 3 years I was about to walk through again. Not just the family stuff, the world stuff. I'd worked in a mid-tier accounting firm in my other life, bored out of my mind doing tax prep for small businesses, and one of the strange side effects of that job was that I paid more attention to markets and public filings than most people my age. I remembered in fragments at first, and then, with startling clarity the more I concentrated, a handful of things that had happened in the 3 years between this morning and the morning I died on an operating table. A regional bank that failed, a little biotech stock that tripled after a drug approval nobody saw coming, and, most importantly, most usefully, an announcement 18 months out of a new state highway interchange and retail corridor slated to run straight past a sleepy residential street on the edge of town, Birchwood Lane. I remembered it because I'd heard Colum Bratcher say it himself, at the closing I wasn't present for, but heard about in agonizing detail from a lawyer who represented me after the money was already gone, too late to matter. Bratcher had bragged, apparently, to the notary about how he'd assembled almost the entire block for pennies because the state hadn't made the interchange plans public yet, how he'd had a contact who tipped him off 18 months before it went to a vote, how by the time anyone else figured out what was coming, he'd already owned everything worth owning. I had 3 years. He had 18 months of head start on secrecy, meaning I had 18 months where I knew what he knew and he didn't know that I knew it too. I opened a savings account that week under my maiden name, which, this time around, was still legally my only name since I hadn't yet met and married and divorced the man whose last name I'd worn like a borrowed coat for 4 unhappy years. And I started putting away everything I could. I kept my job at the accounting firm because I needed the income and because it kept me sharp on filings and financing structures I'd need to understand fast. I read every land record for the town I could get my hands on, cross-referencing tax parcels late into the night with a legal pad full of handwriting that got messier the more excited I became. The biotech stock took more nerve than I expected, even with certainty on my side. I remembered the name, a small drug maker most people had never heard of, working on a treatment for a rare pediatric condition, trading for pennies on the dollar because the market assumed, reasonably, that a company that size wouldn't survive the trial phase. I remembered the headline, the way you remember a single sentence from a newspaper you read once years ago on a train. FDA grant surprise approval, something like that. And I remembered more vividly the sick, furious feeling of reading about it after the fact. In my old life, thinking about how $100 invested at the right moment would have changed everything. And having no $100 to spare because every cent I had was tied up fighting Denny and Priya in court. This time, I had 8 months of saving behind me and a job that paid enough, if I was careful, to leave something over every month. It still wasn't much. $11,000, every bit of it money I couldn't afford to lose, sitting in an online brokerage account I'd opened under a name that meant nothing to anyone who knew me. I remember the night I placed the order, sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor with my laptop balanced on a couch cushion, my finger hovering over the confirm button for what felt like 10 minutes before I finally pressed it, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I closed the laptop and didn't look at it again for 4 days because I physically could not stand to watch the number move. When the approval came through, on the date I remembered, though I hadn't let myself fully believe it would land exactly right until I saw it, the stock didn't just triple. It went up faster than that in the first 2 days alone, and I sat at my desk at the accounting firm, refreshing a browser tab under my keyboard, trying to look like I was reviewing a client's quarterly filings while my hands shook. By the time I sold 6 weeks later, staggering the sale across 3 separate transactions so it wouldn't draw attention, $11,000 had become just over $91,000. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after work that day, engine off, just breathing, because it was the first time since I'd woken up in my childhood bed that the plan had felt less like a fantasy and more like something with actual load-bearing weight underneath it. I didn't tell a soul. Not my mother, not the few friends I'd kept close, no one. I formed a limited liability company with a lawyer 3 towns over who didn't know my last name from Eve, called it Birchwood Holdings after the street, and I started buying, not our house, not yet. Buying my mother's house before she died would have raised more questions than I could answer, and besides, I didn't need to buy what was already going to be mine if the will did what it was supposed to do. What I needed was the land around it, the lots she didn't own, the neighboring properties on Birchwood Lane that hadn't yet caught Bratcher's attention because his tip in this timeline hadn't landed yet. There was an elderly widower 2 doors down, Mr. Faraday, who I remembered had sold to Bratcher's company for next to nothing in my old life because nobody else had ever made him an offer. I made him one, a fair one, generous even, enough that his daughter in Arizona stopped worrying about his care costs. There was a rundown rental duplex at the end of the block owned by an absentee landlord who I knew, because I remembered the county records I'd once combed through in grief and fury, was drowning in code violation fines. I bought that too, quietly, through Birchwood Holdings, and fixed the roof myself with contractors I paid in cash and confidentiality. Mr. Faraday took some convincing. He was proud, in the particular way of men who'd owned something outright for 40 years and didn't like being told, even gently, that it might be time to let it go. I sat with him on his porch 3 separate Saturdays before he agreed to anything, drinking sweet tea I didn't really like and listening to stories about a wife who'd died a decade earlier and a daughter in Arizona who called on Sundays and worried audibly every time about whether he was eating enough. I never once mentioned the highway interchange because I couldn't, not without exposing exactly how I knew about it. But I didn't need to lie to him either. I told him, honestly, that I thought the street was going to see real investment in the coming years, that I wanted to be part of that I'd pay him a fair price and let him stay in the house as a renter for as long as he wanted at no cost so his daughter wouldn't have to keep worrying about upkeep bills eating into whatever savings he had left. He cried a little the second Saturday and told me I reminded him of his wife. I cried a little too after I left, sitting in my car outside his house because he had absolutely no idea that in another version of things he'd never lived to see, he'd sold that same house to a stranger for half of what it was worth and moved into an assisted living facility his daughter could barely afford and died there, alone 11 months later. I made sure this time that wasn't going to happen to him either. The duplex at the end of the block took longer, mostly because tracking down the absentee landlord meant 3 months of certified letters and one deeply unpleasant afternoon in a county clerk's office trying to untangle a chain of ownership that had passed through 2 divorces and a bankruptcy. When I finally got him on the phone, he sounded relieved more than anything. The code violations had been piling up faster than he could manage from 4 states away, and my offer, low as it technically was, given the state of the property, was still more than he expected to get from a place he'd all but given up on. I closed on it in 6 weeks. The roof took another 4 months to fix properly, and I spent more Saturday mornings than I care to admit up on a ladder myself, handing shingles to a contractor named Reuben, who never once asked why a woman with an accounting job was so determined to fix up a rental property she didn't seem to need the income from. I told him it mattered to me. That was true enough. The municipal auction for the last vacant lot was almost anticlimactic by comparison. A folding table in a government building basement, 4 other people in the room, none of whom seemed to have any real interest once the bidding passed $9,000. I remember standing there with my hand raised, feeling almost embarrassed by how easy it was, thinking about a version of this same auction that, In my old life, I'd never even known had happened because by the time I might have thought to look, the street had already belonged to someone else. One by one, patient as a spider, I built a web across a street my family didn't know I was watching. By the time I was 2.5 years back into that borrowed life, Birchwood Holdings owned 6 of the 9 addressable lots on Birchwood Lane. My mother owned 3 more, our house and 2 adjoining parcels she'd bought decades ago and never sold. Only 1 lot remained outside my reach. A vacant corner property owned by the city itself, tied up in zoning limbo I knew, from memory, would eventually be sold at a quiet municipal auction that almost nobody attended. I went to that auction. I was the only bidder. I bought it for $11,000. By the time the 18-month mark arrived, the point at which, in my old life, Colin Bratcher had first gotten his tip about the highway interchange I owned through a company he had never heard of and would have no reason to suspect, every single piece of Birchwood Lane that my mother didn't already own herself. I remember sitting in my car outside the county recorder's office after filing the last deed, hands shaking on the steering wheel, laughing and crying at the same time in a way that probably looked to anyone passing by like the beginning of a breakdown. It wasn't a breakdown, it was the closest thing to triumph I had ever felt. And it tasted like grief because the entire time I was building it, I knew exactly what it was going to cost me to need it at all. I didn't spend those years only building a financial trap. I spent them, more than anything, trying to be present with my mother in a way I hadn't fully managed the first time, back when I still thought I had all the time in the world. We took a trip to the coast that second spring, just the 2 of us, something we'd talked about doing for years and always put off. I watched her stand at the edge of the water with her shoes in her hand, 61 years old and laughing at nothing, and I thought about how close I'd come to never seeing this again, and I had to walk away down the beach for a few minutes so she wouldn't see me cry. I also, carefully, without ever naming the fear underneath it, started nudging her toward doctors. Just a checkup, Mom, it's been a while. I read this thing about blood pressure. Humor me. She grumbled about it the way she grumbled about everything I insisted on, but she went. Her doctor found borderline hypertension that first year and put her on a low-dose medication. I don't know, even now, whether that changed anything about what was coming. I told myself it might. I told myself that was enough of a reason to try, even if the deeper machinery of fate didn't care about blood pressure medication one way or another. I also watched Denny and Priya, carefully, from a distance, the way you watch weather rolling in. In this timeline, Mom hadn't died yet, so there was no will to contest, no funeral to weaponize, but I could see the shape of them clearly now, in a way grief and shock had blurred the first time. Priya's compliments always had an angle. Denny's visits, rare as ever, always seemed to circle back to money, a business opportunity he wanted Mom to invest in, a loan he needed just to bridge a gap. I sat through a Sunday dinner that first year where Denny spent 45 minutes walking my mother through a PowerPoint presentation on his phone about a car repair franchise he wanted to open, complete with projected revenue figures that any first-year accounting student could have told him were fantasy, and I watched her nod along, indulgent and hopeful in the way mothers are with sons who've never quite grown into the promise they once saw in them, and I bit down on every single thing I wanted to say. I watched my mother, patient and generous and a little too trusting of her own son, hand him $4,000 that second year for the car repair business that folded within 6 months, exactly the way I remembered it folding the first time, under exactly the same mix of Denny's overconfidence and underinvestment in the boring, unglamorous parts of actually running something. He came back to her table 8 months later with a new idea, a food truck, this time, gone within a season. And I sat through that pitch too, silent, my jaw tight, because I needed him to keep being exactly who he was. I needed the version of Denny I remembered, greedy, entitled, certain the world owed him more than it had given him, to stay perfectly, predictably intact, right up until the moment it would matter most that he was. The hardest part, honestly, wasn't managing my brother. It was Grant Hollis. I found a reason to hire him in that second year for something small, a minor dispute over a boundary line on one of the Birchwood lots, nothing that mattered, nothing that would ever go anywhere. I did it deliberately, coldly, because I remembered the way Hollis worked. The paper trail he left, the sloppy overconfidence of a man who'd never once been made to answer for the corners he cut. Our first meeting was in a strip mall office 2 towns over, the kind of place with a receptionist who doubled as a notary and a waiting room that smelled like carpet cleaner. Hollis came out to greet me in a suit that fit a little too well for a man handling boundary disputes for a living, shook my hand with both of his, and told me, within the first 5 minutes, that he specialized in creative solutions for complicated family situations, a phrase I recognized instantly, because I'd heard my brother repeat some version of it, admiringly at a holiday dinner years before any of this had happened the first time, back when Hollis's name was still just a rumor of a friend Denny had from college who knew how to get things done. I played the role carefully, a busy, slightly harried landowner, too preoccupied with a day job to want to deal personally with a nuisance property dispute. Happy to let a professional handle the details, not particularly interested in the specifics as long as it went away. It was, I discovered, exactly the kind of client Hollis loved, because it meant nobody was reading closely. Over the following months, he CC'd me on emails that had clearly been written for someone else's eyes, referencing other matters he was handling, other families he was helping, resolve things efficiently, language so close to what I remembered from his handling of my own estate dispute the first time around that reading it sometimes made my stomach turn. I never corrected the mistake in CCs. I never mentioned that I'd noticed. I paid him on the books in full through Birchwood Holdings, establishing a relationship, a rapport, a reason for him to underestimate me later, and every single one of those misdirected emails went straight into a folder I backed up in 3 different places, dated, time-stamped, unimpeachable. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy while you're quietly reconstructing your entire life underneath it, and I don't think I've ever fully described to anyone how heavy those years were, even the good parts. I still went to work every day at the accounting firm, sat through the same tedious client meetings, laughed at the same jokes from coworkers who had no idea the woman filing their expense reports owned a shell company worth, by that point, more than the firm itself. I still went to my mother's house every Sunday for dinner, sat across from Denny at Thanksgiving and Christmas and made small talk about his latest scheme, complimented Priya's cooking, held my tongue through 100 small cruelties dressed up as jokes, because I needed all of it, the ordinariness, the low hum of a family that hadn't yet detonated, to stay exactly as unremarkable as it looked from the outside. There was a night about halfway through that second year when I almost broke. I'd just closed on the duplex, had spent the whole day signing papers and moving money and feeling, for the first time, like the plan might actually work, and then I came home to an email from Priya, CCing the whole family, about how some of us had been carrying more of the burden of caring for Mom lately, and maybe it was time for a real conversation about long-term arrangements. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and cried until I couldn't breathe properly. Not because the email itself was so terrible, but because I understood, all at once and completely, that I was going to have to watch this happen twice. That knowing the ending didn't make living through the middle hurt any less. I called in sick to work the next day, the only day in 3 years I let myself fall apart entirely, and then I got up and I kept building. I was building 2 things at once that whole time, and it took everything I had to hold both without letting either slip. A fortress around a street my mother had built with her own 2 hands and a case file, brick by brick, against every person who was going to try to burn it down. The stroke happened on the exact date I remembered, down to the hour. I want to tell you, I stopped it. I didn't. I got her to the hospital faster than the first time. I was there at the house when it happened because by then, I'd made a habit of dropping by unannounced 2 or 3 times a week, telling myself it was for company and knowing, underneath, it was because I couldn't stay away from the last months I was sure I'd get with her. I saw the way her face changed, the slur that came into her words mid-sentence. And I had her in the car and at the ER within 11 minutes, and it made a difference. It made every difference because this time she survived. The days in the hospital afterward were some of the strangest of my whole strange doubled life. I sat by her bed watching monitors trace out the same rhythms I remembered from a version of this that ended in a funeral, and every hour that passed with her still breathing felt like a small, private miracle I couldn't tell anyone about. A neurologist explained, gently, that the damage was significant but that with rehabilitation, most patients regained substantial function, that she was, all things considered, lucky. Lucky. A word that landed strangely on me, given everything I knew about how much luck had nothing to do with any of it. I held her hand while she relearned how to grip a spoon. I sat through speech therapy sessions where she got frustrated, sometimes to tears, at words that used to come easily and now snagged somewhere behind her teeth. And I learned to wait through those silences without rushing to fill them for her because the therapist explained that finishing her sentences, however well-intentioned, only made the frustration worse. There was one session, about 3 weeks in, where she was trying to say the word garden, and it kept coming out broken, half-formed, and she finally slammed her good hand flat on the table and said, with tears streaming down her face, "I sound stupid. I sound like I don't know my own life." And I had to leave the room for a minute so she wouldn't see me cry too, because I remembered a version of her who never got the chance to be frustrated about a stumbled word again, who simply stopped speaking at all, forever, on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years from a morning I couldn't get back to fast enough. I never once let her see how much it cost me to watch because I understood, better than any doctor in that building, exactly how much worse this could have gone. I brought her the same photo albums every week, propped them on her hospital tray, and made her tell me the stories behind the pictures even when the words came slow because the physical therapist said the effort mattered more than the fluency. And because, selfishly, I wanted to hear every one of those stories one more time from a woman I'd been sure in another life I would never hear tell them again. She survived, but she was changed by it. A weakness on her left side, some slurring that never fully resolved, a frailty that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that Denny and Priya, God forgive them, read the exact same way a shark reads blood in the water. They swooped in within days. Priya took an unpaid leave from her job to help out, which mostly meant sitting at my mother's kitchen table with paperwork and a soft, concerned voice, gently suggesting that maybe now was the time to think about the future, about the house, about what would be easiest for everyone given Mom's condition. Denny started dropping by more than he had in years, always with the same script about wanting to make sure Mom was protected, always somehow landing on the idea that the house and the land might be better managed, better secured if it were sold and the money put somewhere safe. I watched it happen exactly the way I remembered it happening the first time, except this time I wasn't blindsided by grief, wasn't fighting from a position of ignorance and exhaustion. This time, I let them think they were getting away with something. I played the tired, overwhelmed daughter, the one juggling a full-time job and her mother's care, too distracted to notice what her brother and sister-in-law were quietly maneuvering behind her back. I let Grant Hollis, whom Denny brought back in almost immediately, believe I had no idea he was already drafting language to challenge whatever new estate plan my mother might make in case the old will died, which this time, I knew for a fact she hadn't yet updated to reflect the properties Birchwood Holdings now owned because those properties weren't in her name to begin with, they were in mine. Didn't give them the angle they needed. There was a piece of black, cold logic to what I did next that I'm not proud of exactly. But I don't regret it either. I needed them to complete the betrayal. Not almost, not in spirit. I needed Denny and Priya to actually fully, provably attempt to defraud a medically vulnerable woman out of property she didn't even fully own anymore, on paper that they didn't know had already changed underneath them, so that when it came time to end this, there would be no ambiguity left for anyone. Not a judge, not a journalist, not even my own conscience to hide behind. There was an evening about 3 weeks after the stroke when I nearly lost my composure entirely. I'd stopped by unannounced the way I often did and found Priya alone at the kitchen table with a folder of documents spread out in front of her, and my mother upstairs napping, worn out from a physical therapy session earlier that day. Priya, startled when I came in, closed the folder a fraction too quickly and said brightly, "Oh, just some paperwork for her insurance, boring stuff. Don't worry about it." In a voice pitched exactly the way it always was when she was lying. A cadence I'd learned to recognize the hard way, the first time around, when it was already too late to matter. I said something non-committal and left 20 minutes later and sat in my car at the end of the driveway for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel, thinking about how badly I wanted to walk back in there and rip that folder out of her hands and end this right then, months ahead of schedule, before it could go any further. I didn't. I made myself drive away because I knew, the way you know the exact moment in a chess game when taking a piece early would cost you the board, that I needed the fraud complete and undeniable, not merely suspected. A folder glimpsed on a kitchen table wasn't evidence of anything. It would only tip them off that I was watching, and a version of Denny and Priya who knew I was paying attention was infinitely more dangerous than the arrogant, careless version I remembered. The one who never imagined for a second that the sister he'd spent his whole life underestimating might be 3 moves ahead of him. So I let it go. I drove home. I opened my laptop and quietly downloaded everything Grant Hollis had sent me that week for the boundary dispute I'd hired him for, filed it in the folder I'd been building for 2 years, and went to bed. And then the timeline caught up with the one piece of it I couldn't outmaneuver: my appendix. I don't know if it was fate or genetics or just cruel coincidence, but the same infection that had put me under a scalpel the first time announced itself on almost the same week, the pain doubling me over at my desk at work, the ER doctor telling me, with a gravity that made my stomach drop even though I already knew what was coming, that it was rupturing, that we didn't have time to wait, that I needed surgery within hours. I remember lying on the gurney before they wheeled me back, staring at the fluorescent light sliding past overhead, thinking, this is it. This is the exact moment where it all went wrong before. And this time, instead of terror, what I felt, God help me, was something closer to readiness. I had already won. They just didn't know it yet. I called Denny from the pre-op room anyway because I needed it on record, needed the paper trail of a woman who trusted her family right up until the last possible second. Please don't let anything happen with Mom's house stuff while I'm under, I said, my voice thin with real fear, because some of it, it's just the fear of dying, the fear of never waking up at all, wasn't performance. Please, Denny. Of course not, Mara, he said, smooth as oil on water, and I could practically hear Priya in the background, and I thought, almost gently, almost with pity, you have no idea. The surgeon who came to talk to me before they wheeled me back was young, kind-eyed, clearly trying to be reassuring. Routine procedure, she said. You'll be back on your feet in no time. I nodded and thanked her and did not tell her that the last time someone had said something like that to me, I'd flatlined on the table because there was no version of that sentence that wouldn't have sounded insane coming out of my mouth. Instead, I lay there, staring up at the same fluorescent lights, running through the case file in my head one more time like a rosary. The Faraday deed, the duplex closing, the auction receipt for the corner lot, the 4 months of Hollis's emails, the controlling stake in Bratcher Development finalized 11 weeks earlier, checking each piece the way you check locks on a door before you finally let yourself sleep. I want to tell you the second surgery was easy because I'd already survived it once. It wasn't. There is no version of going under anesthesia, of trusting strangers with your unconscious body, that stops being frightening just because you've technically done it before in another life. If anything, it was worse because I understood exactly how much could still go wrong, how the last time I'd slipped under like this, my heart had stopped, and there was no guarantee, none at all, that the universe owed me a second rebirth if the first one failed to hold. I remember the mask coming down. I remember counting backward. I remember a flicker of pure animal fear that this was the real ending, that everything I'd built over 3 borrowed years would simply cease to matter because I would simply cease. And then there was nothing, a long, formless nothing, until there was a ceiling tile swimming into focus above me and a nurse's hand on my wrist and a voice saying, "There she is, welcome back." I was alive. My heart had held. I spent 2 days in recovery in a haze of relief, so profound, it took me most of the first day just to remember why relief mattered so much. A nurse named Odalis checked on me every few hours, and at one point, adjusting my IV, she asked if I had any family coming by, and I told her honestly that I wasn't sure, and something in my face must have given away more than I meant it to, because she squeezed my shoulder gently and said, "Well, I'll check on you plenty, don't you worry." And I found myself unreasonably grateful for a kindness that cost her nothing and meant, to me, in that moment, more than she could have known. I thought, lying there, about the version of myself who'd woken up alone after this same surgery once before, no family in the waiting room, a house already gone, a life already unraveling around her before she'd even opened her eyes. I thought about how strange it was to be lying in nearly the same bed, recovering from nearly the same wound, and to feel underneath the physical pain something that wasn't devastation at all, but a kind of grim, coiled readiness, like an animal that has finally, after years of running, found solid ground to plant its feet on and turn around. And then, on the second day, my phone buzzed with a text from Denny. "Hey, once you're feeling up to it, we should talk. Family stuff. Nothing urgent. Feel better." 2 exclamation points. I remember that detail with a clarity that still makes something in my chest go cold and quiet, because I knew, the way you know a storm has already made landfall somewhere just out of sight, that it meant it was done. Whatever they'd done, it was already signed, already filed, already in their minds, safely behind them. I didn't call him back. I let 2 more days pass playing the recovering patient, weak and slow and unbothered, and I used every one of those hours to confirm, quietly, through channels they didn't know I had, exactly what had happened. They'd done it fast and they'd done it ugly. With me under anesthesia and unreachable, and with my mother 3 weeks post-stroke, still slurring her words, still weak on her left side, Priya had sat with her at the kitchen table and walked her through paperwork that Grant Hollis had drafted. Paperwork my mother, medicated and exhausted and trusting the daughter-in-law who'd been so attentive lately, signed without fully understanding that it authorized a sale of the house and the 2 adjoining lots she still personally held title to. Hollis had backdated a limited power of attorney using an earlier, unrelated document my mother had signed months before for an entirely different purpose, stretching its language to cover far more than it had ever been meant to. And with that thin, fraudulent authority in hand, Denny had signed a closing agreement with a buyer he already had lined up, Bratcher's company. They'd sold the house and the last 2 lots for $210,000, a laughable fraction of what even just those 3 parcels were worth, let alone what they'd be worth once an interchange broke ground half a mile away. Denny and Priya split the money before I was even off the recovery floor. What they didn't know, what nobody but me and a lawyer 3 towns over and a shell company called Birchwood Holdings knew, was that Bratcher's development firm had 4 months earlier quietly agreed to a controlling investment from an outside holding group in exchange for a capital infusion he badly needed after a separate project ran over budget. That controlling investment had come from me. Bratcher didn't know my face. He'd dealt with lawyers and a numbered account and a name on paperwork that meant nothing to him. But the money that let him keep operating, the money that let him make Denny and Priya their offer at all, was mine. They had sold my mother's house to a company I owned, using authority they didn't legally have while I was unconscious under a surgeon's knife. And they thought they'd gotten away clean. I let them think that for exactly 9 more days. I needed the time to make sure the paper trail was airtight. Every email of Grant Hollis's boasting about creative resolutions, every filing that would show the power of attorney had been misapplied, every bank record showing Denny and Priya splitting a payment that never should have existed. I met with a real estate fraud attorney under an assumed consultation, laid it all out, and had her confirm in writing exactly how deep the hole they'd dug themselves was. Elder financial exploitation, fraudulent use of a power of attorney, and, because my mother's diminished capacity in the weeks following her stroke was medically documented, potential criminal exposure, not just civil liability. Then Denny invited me to dinner. I understood exactly why the moment I got the text, because I remembered with a clarity that made my hands cold that this was the conversation from my old life too. The one where they'd finally told me what they'd done, except back then I'd gotten it over a phone call because they hadn't even wanted to see my face. And this time, apparently, flush with confidence, believing there was nothing left for me to do but accept it, they wanted the satisfaction of watching me absorb it in person. I wore something plain, I let Priya hug me at the door and ask, with genuine-sounding warmth, how I was feeling, and I said, "Better, thanks." And I sat down at their dining table across from my brother and his wife, and I waited. Denny cleared his throat about halfway through the meal, in that particular way he'd always had of announcing bad news like it was a favor he was doing you. "So, while you were recovering, we had to make a decision about Mom's place. Time-sensitive stuff. You know how it is with real estate." He glanced at Priya, who nodded encouragingly, like he was a child reciting a poem he'd memorized. "We sold it, the house, the 2 lots, it's done." I let the silence stretch. I let my face do exactly what my face wanted to do, which was nothing at all. A stillness I'd practiced in mirrors for months without quite admitting to myself why. "With Mom's power of attorney," Denny continued, filling the silence himself, the way he always did when he mistook my quiet for weakness instead of what it actually was, which was patience. "I know it's a lot to process, but honestly, Mara, it's better this way. Cash in hand, no more fighting over property, no more stress on Mom. We split it evenly with you in mind, and there's a portion set aside for you too once things settle." "That's generous of you," I said, and watched Priya relax, just slightly at the word, mistaking it for surrender the way she'd always mistaken my politeness for weakness. Mom signed that power of attorney herself? While she was recovering? She understood exactly what she was signing, Priya said, a shade too fast. We wouldn't have let her sign anything she didn't understand. We were very careful about that. I'm sure you were, I said. Denny reached across the table and patted my hand, the exact same gesture he used to use when we were kids, and he'd broken something of mine and wanted to head off the tears before they started. I know this is hard to hear right after surgery. You've been through a lot. But we handled it, Mara. You don't have to worry about any of it anymore. I looked at his hand on top of mine for a long moment before I pulled it back. No, I agreed. I don't. That was a lie. Obviously, added on the spot, a bone thrown to a dog they assumed was already beaten. I almost laughed. I didn't. Who'd you sell it to? I asked instead, my voice perfectly level. A development company, Priya said, a little too quickly, a little too proud. Bratcher Development. Colin Bratcher's actually a really sharp guy. He's got big plans for that whole area. There's supposedly a highway thing coming through eventually. She waved a hand as though the specifics were beneath her. Point is, he offered fast cash, no contingencies, and honestly, Mara, given everything with Mom's health, we needed fast. How much? I said. Denny hesitated, the first crack in his composure. $210,000, I repeated, tasting each word. For the house and 2 lots on a street that's about to have a state highway interchange built half a mile away. Silence. I watched something flicker behind Priya's eyes. Not guilt. Not yet. Just the first thin edge of confusion. The sense that the conversation had drifted somewhere she hadn't planned for. How do you know about the interchange? Denny said slowly. I finally let myself smile, and I want to be honest, it didn't feel kind. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in 3 years. Because I've known about it for a year and a half, I said. Long enough to buy every other lot on Birchwood Lane before either of you had any idea it mattered. Long enough to become the majority investor in Bratcher Development 4 months ago, which means the $210,000 you just split between yourselves for defrauding a stroke patient, you sold that house to me. I have relived that moment more times than I can count, and it never gets old. The way Denny's face actually went gray, the way Priya's fork clattered against her plate, and she said, That's not possible. You don't have that kind of money," in a voice that had climbed half an octave. I didn't. I said, 3 years ago, I do now. I laid it out for them methodically because I'd waited 3 years to say every word of it, and I was not going to rush. I told them about Birchwood Holdings. I told them I owned 6 of the 9 lots on that street outright, and now, thanks to their own signatures, owned the last 2 along with the house through my controlling stake in Bratcher Development, meaning I owned, as of the paperwork they'd signed 9 days earlier, every single parcel on Birchwood Lane. I told them I had every email Grant Hollis had ever sent bragging about creative resolutions to estate disputes for other clients going back 2 years because I'd hired him myself deliberately to build that exact file. I told them I had a fraud attorney who'd already reviewed the misapplied power of attorney, the backdated document, the timeline of a signature taken from a woman 3 weeks removed from a stroke, still slurring her words, still not fully recovered, and that the term she'd used more than once in our consultation was criminal exposure. You can return the $210,000, I told them, and sign an affidavit acknowledging the fraudulent nature of the transfer, or I can hand every piece of this file to the district attorney's office and let a jury decide what happens to 2 people who forged authority over a disabled woman to steal from her while her daughter was in surgery. Your choice. But I want to be very clear about something first. I stood up from their table. I remember my hands were steady, which surprised me because inside I was shaking with something that felt less like anger and more like 3 years of grief finally finding somewhere to land. You didn't just try to steal a house, I said. You tried to steal it from a woman who almost died twice trying to protect it. And you did it the second time while I was unconscious on an operating table, the same way you'd have done it the first time if I'd let you. I know exactly who you are. I've always known. The only difference is that this time I made sure it wouldn't matter. Denny tried to laugh it off first, a short, disbelieving bark that didn't reach his eyes. You're joking. This is a joke. You don't have that kind of... You work at an accounting firm, Mara. You file other people's taxes. You're not... He stopped himself, and I watched him actually do the math in real time. Watch the pieces he didn't want to assemble themselves anyway behind his eyes. The years I'd been quiet. The years I hadn't fought him publicly the way I once had. The years he'd mistaken for surrender. Priya found her voice before Denny did, sharp and rising, the way people get when they're cornered and haven't yet accepted it. You've been planning this? You've been sitting on this for years? Setting us up? What kind of person does that to their own family? The kind of person whose family sold her dying mother's house while she was flatlining on an operating table, I said. And I said it flatly, without heat, because by then the anger had burned down into something colder and far more useful. You didn't ask what kind of person does that when you were splitting $210,000 over dinner. You only asked once it stopped working out for you. Denny's face had gone from gray to something closer to desperate. Mara, come on. We're your family. Whatever we did wrong, we can fix it between us. We don't need lawyers. We don't need... Please, just tell us what you want. I already told you, I said, standing up, sliding my chair back in with a care that felt almost ceremonial. The money and the affidavit. That's the only offer on the table, and it isn't going to get better the longer you sit here trying to talk me out of it. They chose the affidavit in the end because Grant Hollis, facing the very real possibility of disbarment and criminal charges of his own for the backdated power of attorney, folded the moment my fraud attorney reached out to him directly, offering a narrow exit in exchange for a sworn statement laying out exactly how he'd manipulated the document, at whose direction, and with what knowledge of my mother's diminished capacity. He threw Denny and Priya under the bus without a second thought because that is precisely the kind of man he'd always been. And I'd known it, and I'd used it, and I don't feel a single ounce of guilt about that. Denny and Priya returned the $210,000, money that had briefly felt like a windfall and became, almost overnight, a debt neither of them could easily absorb because they'd already spent a chunk of it on a boat Denny had been eyeing for years. They signed the affidavit. I chose not to pursue criminal charges, not out of mercy exactly, but because I understood something by then that I hadn't understood the first time around. The fight was never really about punishment for its own sake. It was about making sure they could never again mistake my patience for permission. Grant Hollis called me himself, 2 days after the dinner, his voice stripped of every ounce of the oily confidence I remembered from 3 years of watching him operate. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, he started, and I let him talk for almost a full minute before I cut in. There isn't, I said. I have 4 years of your emails, Grant. The boundary dispute file alone has you describing, in writing, 3 separate creative resolutions you arranged for other clients contesting estate documents. My attorney's already spoken to the Bar Association informally just to understand what a formal complaint would look like alongside a fraud referral to the DA. You have one conversation left where anyone is going to listen to what you have to say, and it's the one where you tell the truth in a sworn statement, instead of the one where you go to prison for elder fraud alongside my brother. The line went quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, all the performance had drained out of his voice, leaving something smaller and much more human underneath it. What do you need from me? He gave my attorney everything within the week, the backdated authorization, an admission that he'd known, at the time he drafted the closing documents, that the power of attorney he was relying on had never been intended to cover a property sale, and a detailed account of exactly how Denny had pressured him to move the closing forward before I was out of recovery, specifically because Denny understood that once I was conscious and lucid again, I'd fight it. It was, in its own ugly way, the single most useful document in the entire case, because it established, in Hollis's own words, that the timing hadn't been an unfortunate coincidence. It had been the plan. The fallout did what fallout always does when you stop protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. Word got around, the way it does in a town small enough that everyone eventually hears everything. Priya lost a part-time position at a local nonprofit board when the affidavit became a matter of public record in an unrelated civil filing. Denny's failed car repair business had already cost him what little credibility he'd clawed together with local contractors, and the fraud affidavit finished the job. Nobody in a town that size wanted their name anywhere near his after that. They moved eventually, 2 states away, to somewhere they could start over without every conversation circling back to what they'd done. I heard secondhand through a cousin who still spoke to both sides that Denny had gone back to selling insurance. The job he'd had before the car repair business, before the boat, before any of it. And that Priya had taken a position doing administrative work at a school district that, as far as I could tell, had no idea about the affidavit sitting in a county filing 2 states over. I felt, when I heard that, less satisfaction than I expected to. Mostly, I felt tired in the particular way you feel tired after finally setting down something heavy. You've been carrying so long you forgot your own arms could ache from anything else. I didn't gloat. I want that to be clear because there was a version of me in the immediate aftermath that wanted to stand on Denny's lawn and list every cruelty out loud one more time. But I found, once the affidavit was signed and the money was returned and the district attorney's file quietly closed without charges, that I didn't need to. The satisfaction I'd been chasing for 3 borrowed years didn't come from watching them suffer. It came from the simple, staggering fact that Birchwood Lane, every foot of it, every deed, every lot my mother had spent decades quietly assembling, was safe, was mine and hers, and never, ever going to belong to anyone who hadn't earned it. The quieter part of this story, the part I hold closer than the revenge, is my mother. I never told her about the rebirth. There was no way to say it that wouldn't have sounded like the ravings of someone who needed to be committed, and besides, some things aren't meant to be explained, only lived through and protected. But I did tell her gently, over the weeks after everything settled, some version of the truth that she could hold on to without it breaking her. I told her I'd been quietly investing for years, that I'd used what I learned to buy up the land around her house because I loved this street as much as she did and didn't want to see it fall into the wrong hands, that when Denny and Priya took advantage of her while she was recovering, I already had the means to make it right. She cried, the first time I told her the full financial shape of it, not from sorrow, but from something that looked almost like awe, like she was seeing her daughter clearly for the first time in years. You did all that, she said, her left hand still a little weak from the stroke, resting over mine on the kitchen table. Quietly for years, and you never once told me? I didn't want you to worry, I said, which was true, if not the whole truth. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face settled. The particular expression of a mother recognizing, late but not too late, exactly who her child had grown into. You're more like me than I ever gave you credit for, she said. I spent 30 years buying up scraps nobody else wanted because I believed they'd matter someday. I just didn't think I'd raise a daughter patient enough to finish what I started. We sat with that a long time, the two of us, in a kitchen that was ours, in a house that was never going to be taken from either of us again, and I thought, not for the first time, that whatever this gift had cost me, the fear of dying twice, the years of secrecy, the particular loneliness of carrying knowledge no one else could ever share, it had also given me this. More years with her. A version of the ending where I got to watch her understand, before it was too late, exactly how much she'd meant. There were harder conversations after that first one, spread out over the following months, because my mother, whatever her weakened left hand and slower speech, had never once in her life been a woman who let a thing go unexamined. She asked, more than once, how I'd known to buy land 18 months before an interchange was publicly announced, how I'd known which stock to bet a life savings on, how a woman who'd spent a decade doing tax prep for small businesses had suddenly developed the instincts of someone twice her age with twice her experience. I never lied to her outright. I told her each time some version of I got lucky, and I made sure not to waste it. And I watched her decide, deliberately, not to push harder, the way you sometimes decide not to open a door you suspect leads somewhere you're not ready to go. I think, in the quiet way mothers sometimes understand things they can't articulate, she suspected there was more to it than luck. I think she chose, out of love, to let me keep whatever I needed to keep to myself. She also asked once, gently, whether I was happy, really happy, not just victorious, not just vindicated, but happy. And I remember sitting with that question longer than any of the others because I honestly didn't know the answer right away. I told her eventually that I thought I was getting there, that watching her stand at the edge of the ocean with her shoes in her hand, or watching her name on a bronze plaque at the entrance to a street she'd spent 30 years quietly building, that those moments felt like happiness, or close enough to it that the difference didn't much matter anymore. The interchange broke ground 14 months later. The retail corridor followed the year after that, and the value of Birchwood Lane did exactly what my mother had always quietly believed it would do. Decades before anyone else could see it coming, it became, almost overnight, some of the most sought-after commercial frontage in the county. I didn't sell a single lot. I developed slowly and on my own terms, working with contractors I trusted, and a design that kept the character of the street my mother had built her whole life around. Instead of flattening it into the kind of soulless retail sprawl Colin Bratcher would have thrown up if he'd ever gotten his hands on it the way he'd planned, I renamed the development project, on paper and on the small bronze plaque I had installed at the entrance to the street, the Eleanor Voss corridor. My mother pretended to be embarrassed by it every time we drove past, and every single time I caught her slowing the car down just slightly, just long enough to read her own name. There was a small unveiling ceremony when the plaque went up, nothing elaborate. A handful of neighbors, the contractors who'd worked on the duplex, Mr. Faraday, in a folding chair someone had carried out for him, a local reporter who'd gotten wind of the story in the vague, sanitized version I'd allowed to circulate, about a daughter who'd invested wisely and honored her mother's legacy. My mother stood in front of that plaque with her cane in her weaker hand and read her own name out loud, slowly, deliberately, the way she'd learned to read difficult words again in speech therapy. And when she finished, she turned to me with an expression I'd never quite seen on her face before. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, but something closer to vindication, 30 years in the making. The particular satisfaction of a woman who had been quietly right about something for longer than anyone around her had believed possible. "They used to tell me I was wasting money on land nobody wanted," she said to the small crowd, her voice catching slightly on the harder consonants but strong enough to carry. "My own son told me that more than once. I wanted on record that I was right, and I'd like a moment of everyone's time to enjoy that fact." A ripple of laughter went through the little crowd, and I laughed too, hard enough that it startled me because I hadn't laughed like that, freely, without some private grief sitting underneath it, in longer than I could easily remember. Afterward, walking back to the car with her hand tucked into my arm for balance, she said, quieter, just for me, "You gave me this. I don't fully understand how, and I've decided I don't need to. But I know what it cost you to make it happen, even if you never say so out loud, and I want you to hear me say thank you, properly, just once, without either of us pretending it isn't a big deal." I didn't trust myself to answer right away. I just squeezed her arm and nodded, and we walked the rest of the way to the car in a silence that held more than most conversations I'd ever had. Bratcher, for his part, never fully understood what had happened to him, never fully connected the numbered holding company that had bailed out his cash flow 4 months before a bad closing to the quiet woman who eventually bought him out of the business entirely once his usefulness to me had run its course. I met him exactly once, at the final buyout signing, a meeting my attorney had arranged and that I almost didn't attend because some petty, satisfied part of me wanted to see his face when he finally understood whose money had been propping up his company the whole time. He was younger than I expected, breezy and a little too confident, the kind of man who'd built a career on being underestimated in rooms full of bankers and then turning around to underestimate everyone else in turn. When my attorney introduced me as the controlling shareholder, he actually laughed, a short, surprised bark before he caught himself. "Your Birchwood Holdings," he said, like he was trying the words out to see if they made sense. And I said, "I've been Birchwood Holdings for a while now, Colum. You've just never had a reason to know my name." I don't know where he ended up after the buyout closed. I stopped needing to think about him the moment his signature stopped mattering to anything I cared about. I kept Mr. Faraday in his house exactly as I'd promised, and he lived to see the little park go in at the end of the block, sitting on his porch most afternoons with a better view of it than almost anyone else on the street. He passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after the interchange broke ground, at home, in the house he'd owned for 40-plus years, surrounded by furniture that had never once been packed into a stranger's moving truck. And his daughter flew in from Arizona and thanked me at the small memorial service, through tears, for giving her father the ending he deserved instead of the one that had been waiting for him. I didn't tell her there had been another ending once, in a version of things she'd never know existed. I just told her he'd talked about her every single Saturday, which was true, and let that be enough. The duplex became affordable long-term rentals for 2 young families who couldn't otherwise have afforded to live anywhere near the new development, something I insisted on over the objections of a property manager who thought I was leaving money on the table. I wasn't interested in squeezing every possible dollar out of Birchwood Lane. I'd had more than enough dollars by then. I was interested in making sure the street stayed something like what it had always been underneath the money, a place actual people lived, not just an address on a spreadsheet. As for me, I stand some evenings at the end of Birchwood Lane where the old vacant city lot I bought for $11,000 at a sparsely attended auction is now a small park with a bench and a young maple tree my mother insisted on choosing herself, and I look down the length of a street that is entirely, unshakably ours, house by house, deed by deed, and I think about A version of me who woke up gutted and grieving in a hospital bed, having lost everything to people who never once deserved the chance to take it. That woman doesn't exist anymore. I made sure of that, patiently, for 3 years, one quiet deed at a time. My mother is 71 now, still a little slow on her left side, still stubborn about coupons, still on clear evenings, walking the length of Birchwood Lane in the shoes she refuses to replace, even though I've bought her 4 new pairs. She built something out of nothing once, and doubted for a long time whether anyone would ever understand what it was worth. I never remarried, though I've dated carefully, cautiously, learning slowly how to trust someone with a version of my life that doesn't require me to explain the parts I can't. I've never told another living soul about waking up in that childhood bedroom with a rabbit-shaped water stain on the ceiling. I've thought about it on quiet nights when the person across the table has looked at me with enough patience that the words almost come, but I've never quite managed it, and I don't know if I ever will. Some gifts I've come to believe are only yours to carry, not yours to share. And I've made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with any scar that healed clean but never quite faded. Sometimes on the anniversary of the day I woke up in the past, a date I still mark privately, alone with a cup of coffee on the porch of a house that will never again belong to anyone but the two of us. I think about the version of my mother who died on a Tuesday afternoon, while I still believed I had all the time in the world, and I let myself grieve her too, quietly. The way you can grieve a thing that didn't happen, but easily, terribly could have. It keeps me honest. It keeps me grateful in a way that doesn't fade into complacency, because I know better than almost anyone alive exactly how thin the membrane is between the life I'm living and the one I could have been condemned to instead. Denny reached out once, about 4 years after everything settled, a short email asking if there was any chance of reconciliation, of starting over, now that enough time had passed. I read it twice, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd once told me, so smoothly, that he'd handled everything while I was in surgery. I thought about my mother, and the maple tree at the end of the street, and Mr. Faraday's porch, and a check for $210,000 that had briefly bought a boat before it had to be returned. I didn't answer with cruelty. I didn't answer with the litany of everything he'd taken and tried to take again. I simply wrote back, I hope you're doing well, Denny. I don't think reconciliation is something I need, and I meant every word of it, and I have not heard from him since, and I have not missed the silence for a single day. What I have instead is this: a street with my mother's name on a bronze plaque at its entrance, a widower's porch that got to stay a widower's porch instead of an empty lot, 2 young families raising their kids in a duplex that could have been demolished for a parking structure, a mother who still walks that street every clear evening in shoes I've begged her to replace, and a version of myself who is no longer waiting for anyone's permission to protect what's hers. She built something out of nothing once and doubted for a long time whether anyone would ever understand what it was worth. I understood. It just took a second chance and a very long memory for me to prove it.